what's always been great about comics as a culture is the line is pretty permeable between fan and aspiring pro and then a legend. And you can just walk up to your formative influences and introduce yourself. You can go up to the legends that are still around and offer to buy them a drink or, you know, buy some original art from them in a way that I don't think is possible in music or film or other professions. I turned in my first script as a working professional 10 years ago.
What was it for?
A fill-in issue of Jack of Fables.
Do you remember what the story was?
Yeah, absolutely I remember what the story was.
What was
I remember a whole act of doing it. It was, so Jack, in Jack of Fables, was the Jack of all Jack fairy tale stories. Yeah. And I did a story where he basically became Tarzan. It was him in Africa with all the different storybook monkeys and apes and gorillas running around having an adventure.
Were you a Tarzan fan before that?
Well, sure, yeah, but I basically just like monkeys in general. So any excuse to put that character on the page with like 20 different apes and gorillas and monkeys and whatnot was too good to pass up.
What was Comic-Con like 10 years ago versus now?
Well, it was awesome 10 years ago. I mean, it was much, much smaller. You know, the entire show, the artist alley, the exhibit floor, all the publishers and exhibitors would fit into one corner of one side of one half of the exhibit floor now.
Yeah.
But it seemed really big to me at the time.
Well, who was there? Do you remember? I mean, I feel like I was talking to Stan Sakai about this, like, you know, when he first started going, you could go, like, hang out by the pool with Jack Kirby, and, you know, it's, like, unbelievable to even think of something like that in 2018, but, like...
Well, but even now, I mean, what's always been great about comics as a culture is the line is pretty permeable between fan and aspiring pro and then a legend. And you can just walk up to your formative influences and introduce yourself. You can go up to the legends that are still around and offer to buy them a drink or, you know, buy some original art from them in a way that I don't think is possible in music or film or other professions.
That's true. Comic books is actually the greatest industry of all time.
Yeah, for that it is.
Did you buy anybody a drink?
Oh yeah, I did. Yeah.
Do you remember who it was?
That show? I mean, that show was largely about kind of connecting with the people I would then soon consider to be my peers, like the people coming in at roughly the same time. People like Francesco Frank Avila, Paul Tobin, Colleen Coover. That's who I was having dinner with.
Kind of huge to think now, though.
Yeah, and Mitch Gerads, who's now a big deal at DC, was a colorist on a book I was doing for Boom at the time. Just an eager, bright-faced kid. Evan Shaner, who's doing a bunch of stuff for DC, was, I think, still in college at the time, and we would hang out a bit. Yeah, it's really crazy to look back and think of, like, what a murderer's row of talent it was just hanging out at the restaurant.
Yeah, that's wild. Yeah, for me it was the same except at a comic book store, you know, like just running up and down, like getting people t-shirts and single issues and stuff, and meanwhile here are all these people that now are like slowly building their way up. It's kind of wild.
It's crazy.
An experience. But now you're working on Witchfinder.
Yeah, I've been a huge fan of Mike Mignola's in general and Hellboy in particular since it started. I mean, I was there when the first issue came out. And the Hellboy and BPRD books were things that I would perennially reread in their entirety, about once every year or so. And so a few years ago, I had the opportunity to pitch an idea for a spin-off, for a plot for one of the spin-off titles. And I'd known Mike socially for years, but I think he was afraid to look at my stuff for that fear that I would suck, you know, because he liked me as a person.
That's fair.
But then when he discovered that I could write, and I knew that world very well, that very quickly developed into a working relationship where, you know, he and I would work out ideas together and then make books. But yeah, Witchfinder, the Victorian occult detective, is absolutely my favorite period in that world and my favorite character in that world. And so getting to work on a new one with Mike and with a British artist who works under the name Disraeli is awesome. I'm a history fanatic, and I'm a bit of an Anglophile. I love secret societies and secret histories and weird occult stuff and weird mythological stuff. And so Witchfinder sits right in the center of the Venn diagram of all of my different interests. But this series in particular, what can I say without spoiling it too much? Well, what can I say without spoiling it too much? There are certain things we know from previous Hellboy stories either odd objects that had shown up or odd things that had happened. And in this storyline, Gates of Heaven, we'll be exploring ways in which things are connected in ways that we didn't quite realize, and that the world that these characters inhabit was bigger and stranger than has previously been suggested, basically.
I know that I feel like people get really picky about anything that is in the Mike Mignola-verse, specifically from an art standpoint. Mm-hmm. What do you think Disraeli is bringing to the page that makes it so that people will be satisfied? What are you satisfied by?
Well, I was the one who suggested him. Because what I like about that world is that Mike's style has evolved over time. And the audience that he's built with those books has a lot of faith in him and his collaborators. So it supports artists who are fairly realistic in representation to those that are fairly cartoony, you know, and different points in between. What's great about Disraeli is he captures the period so well, and he's great at doing like architecture and technology and as well as atmosphere. And so for a book that kind of has a little bit of a steampunk vibe to it, he just seemed like the perfect guy to go to, because I knew he would immediately sell Victorian London, but he could also sell big, crazy Victorian steampunk technology and stuff like that.
Did the two of you do any kind of particular research for this story? Like, was there anything that you were sort of reading up on?
Yeah, I mean, I was kind of a historian by training, and so I love doing research, in part because it's doing a job where I don't have to produce anything for a while. I can just read books and take notes. And really the way the relationship works is that I do tons of research, and then Mike kind of helps remind me what parts don't really belong in the story. Like, that's just facts. That's not part of the story. But yeah, I mean, big piles of history texts and you know, fiction written in the period. But largely like researching the period and then finding where are interesting hooks to hang stories onto.
Yeah, I think it's also kind of tricky because you're trying to tell this larger story and sort of grab at things that people maybe don't know about, which is great, but also you're constantly trying to bring in more people to check stuff out. Yeah. And I'm kind of curious, I know that a little bit of the setup is that, like, you know, like there's murders happening in the London fog, and it's like, well, that's a very familiar thing. Is it intentional to set up something that is familiar so that you can then sort of peel things away? Yeah.
What we're doing very purposely is starting with something that seems like a cliche, and then very quickly revealing that that's not what's happening after all. Because if all you're giving people is the same story they've seen a million times before, why do they need to read that story?
Yeah.
But if you start with more familiar tropes and then show where their expectations have led them astray, because in fact something else is happening, that can create some opportunity for cool storytelling.
Speaking of this idea of like taking a similar story and then doing something that's totally different, this happens a lot in adaptation now, and you've experienced this, that like you made iZombie. There's a TV show for iZombie that is completely different from what you did. And Walking Dead is in that same spot where like they're not following issue to issue. How do you feel about that? Do you think that that's a better sort of tactic to take in adaptation, or?
Well, you know, a comic isn't a collection of storyboards, for one. So if you attempt to go direct one-to-one, you're not going to make a good TV show or movie, more than
That's true. That's true.
I'm not going to...
We're not talking about anybody in particular.
Can't think of any examples. In the example of something like iZombie, what was interesting to me was that Rob Thomas and Diane Ruggiero Wright very much captured the feel of our comic, like the tone of it and the look of it, while telling a completely new story. With a new cast of characters. And as a comic guy, it was really familiar to me, because in comic terms, it's like Earth 2 and Earth 1, right? There's somebody in the Golden Age created a Green Lantern. In the 1970s, that character's reinvented with the same title, the same basic idea, but different character and different explanation and everything like that. But what I think Rob and Diane did was create a show that's much more apt to survive on television than a very faithful adaptation of our comic would have been. But what I find is that people that like one tend to like the other. Whereas if it was a mostly faithful adaptation that changed a few things, people tend to flip over tables and go to the internet to be mad. So.
Well, I mean, that happens no matter what you do. Do you feel like, how much can you sort of stretch Sir Edward Grey, and how much can you stretch, say, somebody like Rasputin, who I know is going to be kind of a factor in certain other stories that are going on.
Well, I mean, to differing degrees, because Sir Edward is a look and a few story points, but there's a lot of territory to explore, you know, and there's a lot of gaps in his biography where we don't quite know what happened, so there's opportunity there. With somebody like Rasputin, or really, you know, Mignola's version of Rasputin, it's a pretty monolithic character, and so there, you do kind of have to just skirt around the edges of what you've already seen. You don't want to like reveal everything you know about Rasputin is wrong in the pages of a new spin-off 25 years after the character first appeared. Whereas with the Sir Edward, who's appeared in like 4 miniseries so far, we can learn, oh, he did something in this period of his life that we hadn't heard about before. So, yeah.
But there is, I mean, there is more Rasputin, like he's going to be involved. So we're not going to find out that like everything you knew was wrong, but are we going to see maybe another side of the die? Are we going to kind of get a sense of some aspect of him that we don't already know? Because he is very monolithic.
The way I've been explaining it to people is Rasputin, the Voice of the Dragon, is about Rasputin in the same way that Bram Stoker's Dracula was about Dracula. In that Bram Stoker's Dracula is largely the story of the people who learn that Dracula exists and who try to do something about it. In much the same way, Rasputin, Voice of the Dragon, is largely the story of a young Trevor Broom learning that there's someone on the other side working with the Nazis, and then having to do something about it. While at the same time, we get to see more about what Rasputin's doing and who he's doing it with. The point of view is going to be the Allies figuring out that he's out there.
What's a book that's coming out right now that you think is a valuable book that you would recommend to anybody, that as soon as you looked at it, you were like, this is a thing that everyone's got to be reading?
Wow, that's a hard question. I don't know. I think I have 25 years of perspective on Hellboy to say that, because I don't know if I would have said that when I read Seed of Destruction. I liked it, but I don't think I would have said, oh, this is going to last for centuries. I think we need, I mean, I really like The Wicked and the Divine by Kieran Gillen and Jamie McKelvey.
Can't go wrong.
Yeah, but I don't know how much of, yeah. Well, I'm going to go with that. Let's say Wicked and Divine. That's going to last.
I think you're probably going to be right. What are your favorite Hellboy, BPRD, and Witchfinder stories? What are the ones that made you want to be a writer in that world? Really,
all the stuff that Mike did the first few years were just cornerstones for me. I mean, those first 4 or 5 trades, I've read them more times than I can count, and they have not aged. And I've told Mike that those books are going to be read and studied long after we're all dust.
Yeah.
Centuries from now, that's going to remain as part of, you know, English literature. It's going to be a thing that survives.